On the morning of February 19th, 2025, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia signed a 26-point strategic cooperation framework with the People's Republic of China in Riyadh. The signing ceremony lasted 47 minutes. It was attended by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and the chief executives of Saudi Aramco and China National Petroleum Corporation. The agreement covered energy pricing architecture, military technology transfers, joint infrastructure investment across 11 African nations, and, most significantly, a formalized commitment to settle a minimum of 50% of all Saudi oil exports in Chinese yuan, rather than US dollars by January 2027. The United States was not invited. No American official was present. No American ally was consulted in advance. Washington learned about the details of the agreement from a Saudi government press release published at 9:14 in the morning, Riyadh time. The dollar's role as the currency of global oil settlement, a structural arrangement that has underpinned American financial power since 1974, has now been formally scheduled for partial dismantlement by the country that created it. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. What happened in Riyadh on February 19th is not a diplomatic setback. It is the beginning of the most significant structural shift in Gulf geopolitics since the original petrodollar agreement. And almost nobody in Washington is prepared to explain what caused it, what it means, or what comes next. To understand the weight of this event, it is necessary to strip away the diplomatic language and identify what actually changed. The petrodollar system, established formally through a series of agreements between the Nixon administration and the Saudi government between 1972 and 1974, created a simple and extraordinarily powerful arrangement. Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations would price their oil exclusively in US dollars. The United States would provide military protection for Gulf monarchies and guarantee their security from external threats. Every nation on Earth that wanted to buy oil, which was every nation on Earth, had to first acquire US dollars to do so. That structural demand for dollars underwrote American deficit spending, suppressed American interest rates, and allowed Washington to project financial power globally in a way that was entirely decoupled from the underlying competitiveness of the American economy. The petrodollar was not simply a currency arrangement, it was the financial architecture of American global hegemony. What Saudi Arabia announced on February 19th is that this architecture is being deliberately revised, not collapsed overnight, but systematically unwound, with a clear timeline, a defined counterparty, and a strategic logic that reflects a fundamental reassessment of what Washington can and cannot offer Riyadh in the current environment. The question that nobody in Washington wants to answer is straightforward. Why is this happening now, and whose decisions made it inevitable? The Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman collectively sit atop approximately 40% of the world's proven oil reserves. Saudi Arabia alone holds 17% of global proven reserves and produces between 9 and 12 million barrels per day, depending on OPEC production decisions. The Strait of Hormuz, the 33-kilometer-wide choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, carries approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 21% of total global petroleum consumption, through a single navigable channel. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, has been the physical guarantor of Hormuz freedom of navigation for decades. That military presence was the enforcement mechanism behind the original Saudi security guarantee. In exchange for dollar pricing and OPEC cooperation, Washington kept the oil flowing and kept the monarchies in power. This was the deal. It was never written into a formal treaty, but it was understood by every party involved with complete clarity. What has changed is not the importance of the Gulf. The Gulf remains as strategically irreplaceable as it has ever been. What has changed is Saudi Arabia's assessment of whether Washington is still a reliable guarantor of the terms of that original arrangement. That assessment has been shifting for years, but 3 specific events between 2019 and 2025 accelerated it beyond the point of quiet recalibration and into the territory of structural realignment. The first rupture point was September 14th, 2019. On that morning, drone and cruise missile strikes hit the Abqaiq oil processing facility and the Khurais oil field in eastern Saudi Arabia. Abqaiq is the single most important oil infrastructure installation on the planet. It processes approximately 7% of global daily oil supply. The attacks knocked out roughly 5.7 million barrels per day of Saudi output, more than half of total Saudi production, for a period of several weeks. The strikes were attributed to Iran-backed Houthi forces in Yemen, though the trajectory analysis conducted by U.S. Central Command pointed clearly to Iranian territory as the launch origin. Saudi Arabia had been a formal U.S. security partner for 45 years. American military assets were present across the Gulf region. THAAD missile defense batteries had been deployed to Saudi Arabia explicitly to guard against this type of threat. None of them intercepted a single drone or missile at Abqaiq. Saudi Arabia absorbed the largest single attack on oil infrastructure in recorded history, and the United States' response was a statement of condemnation and an offer to sell Riyadh more defensive equipment. No military response was executed against Iran. No punitive action was taken. The message received in Riyadh was precise. The American security guarantee had terms and conditions that had not been disclosed when the original arrangement was made. The second rupture was the August 2021 withdrawal from Afghanistan, not because Saudi Arabia had strategic interests in Afghanistan, but because of what the withdrawal methodology communicated about American commitment architecture. The Taliban entered Kabul on August 15, 2021. The U.S.-backed Afghan government, which Washington had spent 20 years and $2.3 trillion building, has collapsed in 11 days. Every Gulf monarchy watched and drew the same conclusion. American security guarantees are conditional, time-limited, and subject to domestic political override without consultation with the guaranteed party. If Washington could exit Afghanistan in that manner, the question of under what circumstances it might exit the Gulf ceased to be theoretical. The third rupture was the period between November 2022 and January 2025. During this period, the Biden administration engaged in sustained pressure on Saudi Arabia to increase oil production in order to lower gasoline prices in the United States ahead of midterm and presidential elections. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, already coldly furious over the administration's initial response to the Khashoggi killing and the subsequent recalibration that never fully restored the relationship, declined. OPEC Plus continued its production cuts. The Biden White House publicly described Saudi Arabia's decision as a hostile act. The relationship between Washington and Riyadh was, by the end of 2024, functional at the diplomatic surface and fractured at the strategic foundation. Into this environment, the first Trump administration had returned with enormous fanfare, promising to restore the relationship. The Saudis watched the early signals closely. What they observed was not reassuring. The specific commitment embedded in the February 19th agreement, settling 50% of Saudi oil exports in Chinese yuan by January 2027, is not symbolic. It has concrete and measurable financial consequences that extend well beyond the bilateral Saudi-Chinese relationship. Currently, the overwhelming majority of global oil transactions are invoiced and settled in U.S. dollars, even when neither the buyer nor the seller is American. Japan buys Saudi oil in dollars. South Korea buys Saudi oil in dollars. India buys Saudi oil in dollars. This creates a structural and continuous global demand for U.S. dollars that has no equivalent in any other currency system. When Saudi Arabia begins settling half of its Chinese exports in yuan, the immediate effect is a reduction in mandatory dollar demand of approximately 2 to 3 million barrels per day worth of transactions, roughly $65 to $90 billion per year at current oil prices that will no longer require dollar conversion. That figure alone does not threaten dollar dominance. But the mechanism it establishes and the signal it transmits are far more significant than the initial volume. Saudi Arabia is not simply changing a billing currency. It is demonstrating to every other major oil exporter that the petrodollar architecture is negotiable. If the country that created the petrodollar system is renegotiating its terms, the implicit pressure on every other OPEC member to follow is substantial. The UAE has already indicated it will expand yuan settlement for Chinese purchases. Iraq has been conducting limited yuan transactions since 2023. The combined effect of a Gulf-wide partial de-dollarization, even partial, even gradual, is a structural reduction in global dollar demand that would require the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. reduce deficit spending, or accept a sustained depreciation of the dollar's international purchasing power. The Congressional Budget Office projects U.S. federal deficits averaging $1.8 trillion annually through 2034. That deficit financing depends critically on the rest of the world, continuing to accumulate and hold dollars as reserve assets. A sustained reduction in dollar demand from oil settlement changes the arithmetic of American deficit sustainability in ways that cannot be corrected by monetary policy alone. The yuan pricing mechanism was the most financially significant element of the February 19th agreement, but it was not the most strategically alarming one for military planners in Washington. But embedded within the 26-point cooperation framework were two provisions that received almost no coverage in American media, but were analyzed with considerable urgency inside the Pentagon and Langley. The first was a joint military technology transfer agreement covering drone warfare systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and, critically, Chinese-developed missile defense architecture. Saudi Arabia has been attempting to procure the Patriot PAC-3 MSE upgrade from the United States since 2019. The upgrade request has been tied up in congressional review, human rights conditions, and arms export licensing disputes for 6 years. China's HQ-9B air defense system offers comparable terminal phase interception capability without conditions, without congressional review, and without a 5-year procurement delay. The February 19th agreement includes a memorandum of intent to begin HQ-9B deployment discussions. If that deployment proceeds, it represents the first major Chinese military system integrated into Gulf Arab defense architecture, a development that would fundamentally complicate American operational planning for the region, since U.S. Central Command's entire regional access framework is premised on interoperability with Saudi military infrastructure. The second critical provision was a joint infrastructure investment commitment covering 11 African nations, with combined projected investment of $340 billion over 10 years. This is not development aid. It is systematic acquisition of port access, mineral extraction rights, and logistics infrastructure across the continent that China and Saudi Arabia have identified as the next major arena of great power competition. The United States has no comparable coordinated investment program in Africa. The Development Finance Corporation has approximately $60 billion in total committed capital. The Saudi-Chinese joint program announced on February 19th is more than 5 times larger. The historical parallel that best illuminates what is happening in the Gulf is not a recent one. It requires going back to 1956 and the Suez Crisis, because Suez was the last time that a major power's allies in a strategically critical region publicly demonstrated that American commitment architecture had hard limits. In October 1956, Britain and France, in coordination with Israel, invaded Egypt to retake the Suez Canal after Nasser's nationalization. Eisenhower, furious that his allies had acted without consultation, threatened to withdraw support from the British pound and allow sterling to collapse unless Britain immediately ceased operations and withdrew. Britain withdrew within days. The episode was publicly and unmistakably understood as the moment when British imperial power in the Middle East ended and American primacy began. The 1956 parallel runs in the opposite direction today. What is ending is not one nation's regional primacy being replaced by another in a single dramatic episode. What is happening is more gradual and more structurally durable. The Gulf states are systematically reducing their dependence on any single external guarantor and building a multipolarity in their security and economic relationships that insulates them from the kind of leverage Eisenhower exercised against Britain in 1956. Saudi Arabia is not choosing China over America. It is choosing a world in which neither China nor America can make the same demand that Eisenhower made of Eden: comply or we withdraw support. That strategic autonomy is the actual objective of the February 19th agreement, and it is considerably more difficult for Washington to counter than a straightforward realignment toward a rival. The agreement exposes 3 structural vulnerabilities in American Gulf strategy that have been accumulating for years but were never addressed with the urgency the situation required. The first vulnerability is the arms sales substitution problem. American military equipment sales to Gulf states have historically been one of the primary mechanisms for maintaining strategic dependency. Riyadh buys American weapons, trains with American doctrine, and integrates with American command architectures. That integration creates switching costs. It is expensive and disruptive to transition military systems, and those switching costs have been the invisible enforcement mechanism behind Gulf cooperation with American strategic preferences. Chinese military systems are now competitive enough in specific domains, drone warfare, air defense, electronic warfare, that the switching costs are declining. Every year that U.S. arms sales are delayed by congressional review or conditioned on human rights compliance, Chinese alternatives become marginally more attractive. Over a decade, marginal improvements accumulate into structural shifts. The second vulnerability is the diplomatic consistency problem. Saudi Arabia has now dealt with 5 American administrations in the post-2001 era, each with substantially different Gulf policies, different tolerance levels for Saudi domestic governance, different preferences on Iran, and different positions on Palestinian statehood. From Riyadh's perspective, American policy is not a stable strategic commitment. It is a variable that resets every 4 years based on domestic American political outcomes that Saudi Arabia has no influence over. China does not have this problem. Beijing's Gulf policy has been consistent, patient, and entirely transactional for 2 decades. It does not ask Riyadh about journalist killings. It does not attach human rights conditions to arms sales. It does not publicly pressure Saudi Arabia to produce more oil to manage American inflation. The consistency differential between the two external relationships, from Riyadh's perspective, now clearly favors Beijing. The third vulnerability is the Iran negotiation problem, and this is the one that Washington is least willing to discuss publicly. The Abraham Accords, the 2020 normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab states, were the signature foreign policy achievement of the first Trump administration in the Gulf. They were premised on the assumption that Arab-Israeli normalization would proceed in parallel with or prior to a Saudi-Israeli normalization that would transform the regional security architecture. Saudi-Israeli normalization is now indefinitely suspended. The Gaza conflict that began in October 2023 made any Saudi public engagement with Israeli normalization politically impossible. The February 19th China agreement signals that Saudi Arabia has decided to pursue its strategic objectives through a different architecture entirely, not through American brokered regional normalization, but through direct economic and security partnerships with the country that happens to be Israel's primary strategic competitor. There are 2 plausible trajectories from here, and the divergence between them will be determined primarily by decisions made in Washington over the next 18 months. The first scenario, call it managed recalibration, involves the Trump administration moving rapidly and credibly to address the 3 structural vulnerabilities identified above. That would require accelerating and deconditioning arms sales to the Gulf, establishing a consistent and durable Iran policy that Saudi Arabia can plan around, and constructing a credible American infrastructure investment program in Africa and the broader developing world that gives Saudi Arabia a compelling American economic partnership to balance against the Chinese one. The probability of this scenario succeeding is not zero, but it requires a speed and coherence of policy execution that has not characterized American Gulf strategy in the post-2003 period. The second scenario, that's structural drift, is considerably more likely based on current trajectories. In this scenario, Washington continues to process the February 19th agreement primarily as a diplomatic irritant rather than a structural warning. Congressional debates about Saudi arms sales continue to be driven by domestic political considerations. The yuan settlement mechanism expands to 60, then 70% of Chinese purchases. The HQ-9B deployment discussions convert into a procurement agreement. Other Gulf states, observing that Saudi Arabia absorbed no meaningful American response to the February 19th framework, begin their own quiet bilateral discussions with Beijing. Within 5 years, the Gulf's security architecture looks fundamentally different from what it looked like in 2020. American military presence maintained, Fifth Fleet still in Bahrain, but the economic and strategic dependency relationships that gave that presence its leverage have been systematically diluted. The United States becomes, in the Gulf, what Britain became in 1956, a military presence without the economic and political leverage that once gave that presence its strategic weight. Here is the complete picture as it stands today. On February 19, 2025, Saudi Arabia signed a 26-point cooperation framework with China that includes yuan settlement for half of all Chinese oil purchases by 2027, Chinese military technology transfers, and $340 billion in joint African infrastructure investment. Saku, the agreement is the culmination of three sequential failures of American strategic commitment: the non-response to Abqaiq in 2019, the Afghanistan withdrawal methodology in 2021, and the sustained deterioration of the U.S.-Saudi relationship between 2022 and 2025. The petrodollar architecture that has underwritten American deficit financing and global financial primacy since 1974 is being formally scheduled for partial dismantlement by the country that originally agreed to sustain it. The dollar demand reduction, the military technology transfer, and the African infrastructure competition are each individually manageable. Together as a coordinated strategic reorientation, they represent the most significant structural change in Gulf geopolitics in 50 years. Washington has not yet produced a public strategic response. Nobody in the administration has explained what combination of policy failures made this outcome inevitable. Nobody has outlined what a credible corrective strategy looks like or whether the domestic political conditions exist to execute one. That silence is itself a data point. The countries that understand what is happening are already adjusting their positions. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. When the American strategic response materializes, if it does, the analysis will be here. When the HQ-9B deployment discussions produce a procurement decision, the analysis will be here. When the yuan settlement mechanism expands beyond the initial 50% threshold, the analysis will be here. Evidence first. What it means for you, always. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can Washington reverse this realignment, or has the structural drift already passed the point where incremental policy adjustments change the outcome? Every response gets read.